This begins Unit 6, which is about cell energy. So we're going to be studying about cellular respiration and photosynthesis. There will be several videos in this set because we need to break it down into smaller parts. So first of all, talking about the need for this kind of thing. In eukaryotic cells, cellular respiration does these things. It gets energy from food, it makes a lot of ATP, and it uses the ATP to do the work of the cell. After all, ATP, the energy molecule, is the currency for energy in the cell. It's the convenient amount of energy to do lots of different cellular processes. There's a very similar process to this that takes place in many prokaryotes, but we're going to focus more on the eukaryotic process because that's more appropriate to what we're studying here. Remember that all life needs energy, and the energy ultimately comes from the sun in almost every ecosystem that you'll come in contact with. In photosynthesis, photosynthesis uses energy from the sun, captures it by the chloroplasts, and rearranges the molecules in carbon dioxide and water to produce glucose and oxygen. Okay, glucose is the main purpose of photosynthesis. We also enjoy the oxygen, which is what we breathe. Respiration is pretty much the opposite process of photosynthesis. You take the glucose that's produced by photosynthesis using oxygen to break it down into carbon dioxide and water, and releases energy in the form of ATP for the cell to use for its processes. Most of the cellular respiration process in eukaryotic cells takes place in the mitochondria. There are similar things that happen again in some prokaryotes, but it's not exactly the same. So just to summarize, we have the sunlight. Remember, the energy in an ecosystem passes through the ecosystem, whereas the matter in the ecosystem is recycled within the ecosystem. So the energy from the sun is used by chloroplasts to make glucose. That's the matter, okay, using carbon dioxide and water and oxygen. Those two molecules are used in cellular respiration in the mitochondria to release energy for cell work in form of ATP plus heat energy. And it releases water and carbon dioxide, which are then used again by the chloroplast to make the food. So it is a cycle definitely within the ecosystem as the energy passes through. Now, oftentimes you hear the term respiration to refer to breathing. There is a relationship between the two. Most of the time in biology, when we speak of respiration, we'll be speaking of cellular respiration. But just so you'll know, the breathing, the respiration in terms of breathing, means exchanging gases or oxygen for carbon dioxide. Cellular respiration is the aerobic harvesting of energy from food molecules by cells. It uses the oxygen that you breathe in and produces as a byproduct, as a waste product, the carbon dioxide that you breathe out. So there is a relationship between the two. But we'll mostly be talking in biology about cellular respiration. So just to show again, when you breathe in oxygen, okay, it comes in, it's absorbed into your bloodstream through the lungs. It carries it to cells, like muscle cells, that are carrying out cellular respiration to release ATP. And they produce, as a result of that, carbon dioxide and water vapor, which travel through the bloodstream back to the lungs and are breathed out. So there is a relationship between breathing and cellular respiration. The big thing about cellular respiration is it stores up, it makes ATP molecules that can be put aside and used for processes in the cell as they're needed. This whole process is an exergonic or energy releasing reaction, and it's going to transfer the energy that is stored in the bonds of the glucose molecule to the form of ATP. Overall, cellular respiration produces up to 34 ATP molecules for every glucose molecule. This is according to the textbook we're using now. Other textbooks sometimes refer to the numbers 36 or 38. Just know that somewhere in the 30s would be the amount of ATP that is produced by cellular respiration from each glucose molecule. There are different methods of measuring this, and scientists don't always agree about what should be counted and when and how it exactly works. So we're going to go with 32 this time, knowing that sometimes you'll see the numbers 36 or 38. The big thing also is that cellular respiration really only takes about 34% of the energy that is available in glucose. The rest of it is lost as heat or used for other processes. Now there are other things, other organic molecules, other food molecules that can also be used as an energy source. but we're going to focus on how it works with glucose, and that helps you understand the whole process. Here's the process, the equation for the process of cellular respiration. Glucose combines with 6 molecules of oxygen to produce 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water, plus ATP and heat energy. This is an overall equation for a very complex multi-step process. We're not going to just add this together. There are several steps in which this occurs, so it's going to be a little bit different, but it's going to involve using carbon dioxide and oxygen as reactants and producing using glucose and oxygen as reactants and producing carbon dioxide and water and ATP as products. The way this happens is that the energy of electrons, basically, that are being moved from a higher energy state to a lower energy state, falling, as you might say, is going to get the energy from that change in state of the electrons to use that to produce ATP. And we extract that energy, of course, by means of the reactions of cellular respiration. When we take glucose and break it down into its component parts, okay, in this process, electrons are transferred to oxygen. Remember, oxygen is very electronegative. It has a tendency to attract electrons. And so anytime you have something that's going to be less attractive to the electrons than oxygen is, the oxygen's going to get them. When the electron transfers from the molecule it's in over to the oxygen, it's going to lose potential energy. And so we're going to say it falls in energy. We can release energy from glucose by simply burning it. There's a great experiment you can do with a gummy bear, just burning a gummy bear, and you'll see it produces lots of heat and light. There are lots of videos on YouTube you can see that show this. But the problem is, when you produce it this way, it's too much energy for the cells to use. It's actually damaging. So think about what would happen if you ate something that was too hot, or drank like some hot chocolate or some coffee that was too hot. It burns and scalds your mouth. And so you wouldn't want that to be happening inside your cells because it would be harmful. Cellular respiration is a way of doing this, of releasing the energy from the organic molecules that is a controlled breakdown. It breaks it down gradually, releases in small amounts, and stored in the molecules of ATP that can be used by that biological system in a much more efficient way, and it's not harmful to the cells. The equation that we look at when we look at cellular respiration helps us see those changes in what happens to the hydrogen ions. Okay, so basically glucose is going to lose its hydrogen atoms and become oxidized to carbon dioxide, and oxygen is going to gain hydrogen atoms and become reduced to water. Oxidized and reduced are chemistry terms that refer to the movement of electrons. When electrons move, they usually take their protons with them, which makes a hydrogen atom. Okay, so we're just going to say when glucose loses hydrogen, it's becoming oxidized, and when oxygen gains hydrogen, it's becoming reduced. You'll see those terms. It's not necessarily important right now for you to understand what they mean, but you'll see the terms, and so that's what we're talking about when we mention that. So here's what happens to our equation. Here's our glucose. We're going to lose hydrogen atoms and if we take the hydrogen out, we're going to get 6 CO2s, right? If we add the hydrogen to the oxygen, we're going to gain 6 waters. And we're going to produce some ATP and some heat along the way. The enzymes, there are enzymes that are necessary for this entire process. Every one of these reactions that happens in this whole process requires enzymes to catalyze them. One of the enzymes that we're using in the process of oxidizing glucose is NAD+. NAD+ is a molecule. It stands for nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. It accepts electrons and becomes reduced to a molecule called NADH. And you'll see NAD and NADH in various parts of this process. There are some other ones as well, like FAD becomes FADH2 in the same type of process. And these are going to carry those high energy electrons to the final part of the process, which is the electron transport chain, where most of the energy is produced. So we have a simple compound here, a carbon compound. This is a simple sugar. Basically, we're going to take the hydrogens off of it and change this bond on the oxygen to a double bond so that this carbon has all of its bonds filled up. It's going to become oxidized when you remove the hydrogen, and that hydrogen is going to be added to NAD to reduce it to NADH. There are the electrons that are transferred here, and one hydrogen proton make it NADH. Plus we have an extra proton there that can be used, and we will use that proton in the process. It's an important part as well. There are other carrier molecules like that, like FAD, like I said a while ago. There are also some carrier molecules that are located in the inner membrane of the mitochondrion, forming what we call an electron transport chain. And basically, they're going to pass the electrons from one molecule to the next, kind of like when you're warming up for baseball or softball and you're tossing the ball, throwing the ball around the horn from the first baseman to the second baseman to the third baseman to the catcher, back to the pitcher. Same kind of thing happens. The electrons are passed from one to the next. When the electrons are passed this way, they're transported down this chain. They're going to give energy that's going to allow ATP to be generated at the end of the process. And we'll talk about how all these things happen. So here we have our NAD transferring electrons to the electron transport chain. The electrons are passed from one molecule to the next. Each step of the way they're losing some energy. Some energy is being used, and that energy is going to be used to help produce ATP. At the end, those electrons have now fallen to a lower energy state. They're going to be attracted to this very electronegative oxygen and join up with some protons that are available in the cytoplasm to produce water. And that's the source of the water in the cellular respiration equation. There are three main parts to cellular respiration. We have glycolysis, which happens in the cytoplasm. That's the first step. And it makes a little bit of ATP and some NADH. We have the molecule pyruvate, which is produced from that, which enters the mitochondrion and is oxidized to another compound called acetyl-CoA, which enters the citric acid cycle, produces a little more ATP and some more NADH and FADH2. And these energy electron-carrying molecules here travel to the electron transport chain where they undergo oxidative phosphorylation to produce lots more ATP. And this is the main energy producing part of the process. So, cellular respiration has three main stages, and we're going to talk about each one of these in turn. Okay, stage 1 is called glycolysis. Stage 2 involves pyruvate oxidation and a cycle of reactions called the citric acid cycle. And stage 3 is a process called oxidative phosphorylation, and this is the one that makes the most ATP. Glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm, right outside the mitochondrion. It is the beginning point of cellular respiration, and its function is to break the glucose down into two molecules of a 3-carbon compound called pyruvate or pyruvic acid that will be used in the next part of the process. The citric acid cycle takes place in the mitochondrion. It takes that pyruvate, changes it to a 2-carbon compound, and eventually breaks it down even further into carbon dioxide and provides some electrons for the third stage, which is oxidative phosphorylation. And this is going to involve the electrons that are carried from those two molecules, NADH and FADH2, which are going to shuttle the electrons to the electron transport chain and use a process called chemiosmosis to generate ATP. Oxidative phosphorylation means we're using oxygen to add a phosphate to a molecule, and the phosphate is going to be added to ADP to make ATP, and that's the source of our energy.